Good evening. I'm Dr. Michael Boyce, Vice President and Academic Dean at Booth University College. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this, the final talk of our 2021-22 Earl Robinson Memorial Lectures on Christian faith in the world. At the beginning of our time together, I would like to acknowledge that the community of Booth University College is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This land is within Treaty 1. The Earl Robinson Memorial Lectures on Christian Faith in the World were established by an endowment of the Canada and Bermuda Territory of the Salvation Army to honor the life of Colonel Earl Robinson, the first president of Booth University College. Colonel Robinson devoted his life to the service of God and the Salvation Army. In spring of 1981, Colonel Robinson, together with his wife, Colonel Benita Robinson, laid the groundwork for this institution, placing Booth on a firm foundation that has seen us grow into a university college rooted in the Salvation Army's Wesleyan theological tradition, bringing together Christian faith, rigorous scholarship, and a passion for service. It is fitting that this lecture series should be offered in his name and in his memory.
One of the keystones of our degree is our internship program. We support our students in an opportunity to take the skills they develop through our classes, go out into the world, and get real hands-on experience helping others. In fact, after graduating, many of our students have actually taken on full-time jobs at the same locations that they actually worked during their internship. And that's my answer to why Booth UC. I'm proud that I get to see our students taking what they've learned and going out to do good in the world.
Rev Dr CarterChand is the director of the program on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust in the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She is the co-editor of Religion, Ethno-Nationalism, and Anti-Semitism in the Era of the Two World Wars, recently published, and has written extensively on the Salvation Army and other minority churches in Nazi Germany and in World War II. We are very privileged to have Dr. CarterChand with us to share her presentation, Polarized Communities in Uncertain Times, Situating the Salvation Army in the German Church Struggle of the Nazi Era. A note on tonight's presentation for those joining us live. We will have some time at the end for some questions following the presentation. If you have questions for Dr. CarterChand, you can submit them through the Q&A function.
Hello and good evening. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm to start, right? Should I get a thumbs up from Michael before I just start talking? I think I'm good. Okay, I will assume I'm good. Thank you so much for having me back again for the second year. Thank you to Michael Boyce and Booth University College and the Robinson family for endowing this lecture series. It's a wonderful thing for Booth University College to be doing, and I'm very privileged to be here. I was here last year and I gave a talk on the Salvation Army's approach to war and peace, and I'm pleased to say that I have developed that into a longer written piece that I hope will be published in an edited volume on social engagement in Pentecostal and holiness traditions, a volume coming out with Penn State University Press next year. This year, I'm choosing to talk about something a little closer to my area of research, which is the Salvation Army in the Nazi period and situating that in the German church struggle and in the complicated church-state relations of Nazi Germany, which is what I deal with a lot in my day job at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So in the Christian tradition, there's this concept of sins of commission and sins of omission. So doing things that are wrong and failing to do the right things. And all too often in discussions about the Christian churches and the Holocaust, there's this emphasis on silence or what the church failed to do. In fact, there's a whole field of study about the silence of Pope Pius XII, who was Pope from 1939 to 1958? Why did he not speak out and condemn the persecution and mass murder of Jews? Why did he not speak out to encourage Catholics to resist? On the Protestant side, there are similar questions about silence, and we can look to some of the earliest statements from the German Protestant Church made after the war, like the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt. And here I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. And it says here, I'm going to just read the part that is in bold, that says, but we accuse ourselves for not standing to our beliefs more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, for not believing more joyously, and for not loving more ardently. And this declaration was seen even at the time as inadequate by many international Christians who pointed out that it only addressed sins of omission, not commission. I want to start with a story about Martin Niemöller, who some of you might be familiar with. Pastor Niemöller was a leading Protestant pastor and became an outspoken opponent of Hitler and was a leader of the Confessing Church, and in fact spent the last 7 years of Nazi rule in concentration camps. And he is most famous for his post-war confession. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And these words, as you see in the photo on the slide here, these words are printed on the wall at the end of the permanent exhibition at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, challenging us all to confront our inaction vis-a-vis others. But many people are surprised to learn that Niemöller was an ardent German nationalist. He harbored typical Jewish stereotypes of his day, and he even voted for the Nazi Party twice, in 1924 and again in 1933. And his famous post-war confession grew out of a reckoning with this past. He told a German audience a few months after the end of the war, he said, "My alibi accounted for the years 1937 to 1945. These were the years that he was imprisoned. But God was not asking me where I had been from 1937 to 1945, but from 1933 to 1945. And for those earlier years, I did not have an answer." In other words, Niemöller did not remain silent about the arrest of socialists, trade unionists, and Jews because he was timid to speak out. He was silent because he also disapproved of them. It was only after the war that he went on a journey of transformation. His words also remind us that these earlier years of the Nazi regime are very important and very complex. And even though there has been a lot of research published about the churches in Nazi Germany that focuses on what they did do, the churches are still often spoken about in the passive, using this concept of bystanders, like they were just on the sidelines, watching what was happening around them and failing to act. This is simply not accurate. The Christian churches were pillars of German society and played an important role in shaping people's attitudes and actions during the period of National Socialism and the Holocaust. Now, the Salvation Army cannot be described as a pillar of German society, but it was a part of that society. And what I want to do in this lecture is situate the German Salvation Army in this volatile context, exploring the theological and structural and practical issues that were at stake for the army as Germany shifted from democracy to dictatorship. And here we see the cover of the German version of the war cry called Der Kriegsruf in 1936, showing photos of the 50th anniversary of the Salvation Army in Germany. And these celebrations coincided with the Berlin Olympics. So we see a number of jarring images. We see Nazi flags, Salvation Army flags. One caption reads, it's in German, but it translates to prayer for the Führer, the Volk, and the fatherland, and for world peace. So how should we interpret these images? At the very least, we can see that the Salvation Army is not suppressed from the public sphere, and it did not hide from demonstrating its allegiances to both the international Salvation Army community and the German community. And hopefully my remarks tonight will help to make a bit more sense of this newspaper cover. But first, to give some context about the religious landscape in Germany, the vast majority of Germans belonged to a Christian church. Approximately 2/3 were Protestant, 1/3 Roman Catholic. Just under 1% was Jewish, and less than 1% belonged to other religious traditions, including a number of small Christian groups that originated in North America and Great Britain. I have these listed on the slide, particularly the second column on the right lists the churches that came to Germany in the second half of the 19th century. The Protestant Church, which is made up of Lutheran and Reformed traditions, and the Roman Catholic Church had long-standing close ties to the state, including receiving subsidies and church taxes, which continued even after World War I, when the new democratic Weimar Constitution of 1919 stated that there was no state church in Germany. Now, the Salvation Army in particular came to Germany in 1886 as the army was expanding across Europe, the United States, and the British Empire. Die Heilsarmee, as it was called in German, faced early hostility and suspicion, but within a few decades went through a successful transplant and gained a good reputation for selfless and practical social work. By the beginning of the First World War, it had over 500 officers and 150 corps. And here you see, I realize that image is rather dark, but that shows the Drunkards Brigade with a stretcher, a man on the stretcher, and the officers with a bicycle, and some of the other social work institutions in the early 20th century. So that's sort of the Salvation Army in the first decades of the 20th century. How this fits into the larger, I'm going to be going back and forth between the big German churches and the Salvation Army to try to give some context to how these fit together in each period. When Hitler came to power in 1933, when he became chancellor in January of that year, most Christians in Germany welcomed the rise of Hitler. But to understand why, I'd say we need to back up a bit and remember that Christians' political views were shaped by several interconnected factors that went beyond just formal religious beliefs. These included German nationalism, certainly a backlash against the Weimar Republic and its liberal values, and fierce anti-communism, because Hitler was seen by many as a bulwark against communism. And there were also dynamics at play related to church-state relations. Among Protestants, there was a traditional loyalty to the governing authorities. And for Catholics and these newer Christian minority groups, there were extra efforts to prove their loyalty to the state. And finally, of course, there was a convergence of Nazi anti-Semitism with widespread anti-Jewish prejudice that had been embedded in European Christianity for hundreds of years, in which the Nazis capitalized upon. Just have a couple images here of the Martin Luther celebrations in 1933 and the Cologne Cathedral. And here is a cover of a German newspaper, Der Stürmer, which is a horribly anti-Semitic newspaper published throughout the period. And here you see one of many examples of the newspaper cover building upon Christian anti-Jewish imagery and tropes here, blaming Jews for the death of Christ on the cross. I don't have time to get into the many long connections But I just want to mention that it's important to recognize that historic anti-Jewish sentiment was not identical to Nazi anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism took on political and racial forms in the 19th century. And the Nazis then radicalized anti-Jewish ideology in many important ways. But what I am saying is that the Nazis used these types of Christian symbols in their expression of anti-Semitism precisely because they knew it would resonate with people. So German society was deeply polarized in the 1930s. This political cartoon from a magazine called Simplicissimus, a German magazine, conveys both the political divisiveness and fighting. You see the symbols of different German political parties on the helmets of these fallen soldiers, which are all, on the ground, fallen on top of each other. And the caption at the bottom says, "If this goes on, all that will be left of us is the Salvation Army." I find it a fascinating political cartoon because I think it shows not only the political divisiveness of the early 30s, but also how Germans viewed the Salvation Army in this period. We could see that they are always present, a public presence, maybe oblivious to the politics or maybe just ignoring what's going on and going on with here it's music. In other depictions, it may have been their work, whether it be evangelism or social work. Now, we know that more Protestants voted for the Nazi Party than did Catholics. And in fact, in the early 1930s, as Hitler's movement was gaining steam, there was a lot of hostility towards Nazism from Catholic leadership. Bishops banned Catholics from joining the party, and some priests refused to allow Nazis in uniform to participate in church rituals or receive the sacraments. They objected to Nazism's ethno-nationalism, its obsession with race and materialism, although they rarely said anything against the Nazis' anti-Semitism. However, the Catholic Church changed its policy and threw its support behind Hitler once he was in power. And in early speeches, Hitler promised that the churches would be protected, which addressed some people's fears that Nazism was an anti-Christian movement. And here in July of 1933, we see the Concordat being signed between the Holy See and Germany. So a Concordat is a treaty between the Catholic Church and a secular government. And this Concordat promised to protect the rights of German Catholics. As the years went on, Pope Pius XI and his successor, Pius XII, pursued a policy of neutrality. So as I mentioned, Hitler made some efforts to appease Catholics in these early days. Hitler was very concerned about public opinion at this time and was eager to consolidate power. And he was savvy enough to know that it would not be a good idea to alienate the churches. Indeed, even the smaller churches with foreign origins, like the Salvation Army, but also like the Seventh-day Adventists or the Quakers, these groups were not banned. Only the Jehovah's Witnesses and a small handful of religious communities were ever banned by the Nazis. And in those cases, it was for refusing to demonstrate their loyalty to the state. Now, in the same month that Hitler became chancellor in Germany, January 1933, the Hausarmee, the German Salvation Army, also got a new leader. International headquarters sent a British officer named William Howard. The nationality of the person holding the top leadership position had long been an area of contention. Most of the territorial commanders had been of British extraction, but since World War I, there had been a push to have more Germans in leadership roles. So Howard and the second in command, Chief Secretary Henry Bowers, also British, faced a difficult situation. Commander Howard tried to keep control of the Hausarmee by affirming the German officers' desire to be part of Hitler's national revolution. In fact, he went to great lengths to affirm the compatibility of the Salvation Army and the quote, new Germany. His monthly letters to German officers indicate that Salvationist support for the Nazis was widespread in 1933. So basically, they were in line with other German Protestants. In December of 1933, so at the end of that calendar year, Howard wrote that since he and his wife had been living amongst them in this period of national awakening, that's a direct quote, in this period of national awakening, he said he could appreciate their feelings. Although their main task was to be soldiers for Jesus Christ, he wrote, quote, "We are pleased that fidelity to one does not exclude faithfulness to the other." Fidelity to one does not exclude faithfulness to the other. Basically, giving permission for Salvationists to be supportive of the Nazi movement or actual Nazis themselves. Now, going back to the main Protestant church, within the main Protestant church, there was also a range of responses to the new Nazi government in this first year, in the first months and first year. And what emerged was really a struggle for control of the German Protestant church between those who sought to create a Nazified church and those who opposed that idea. And then, of course, the many people who sought to remain neutral and not pick a side. And some of you might be familiar with the Kirchenkampf, or the church struggle, which is what I am describing right now. It starts with the German Christians, which is important to notice is the actual name of their movement. It's not a generic description of Germans who were Christians. It was the name of their movement. And the German Christians had a vision for what they considered to be a racially pure church. And they began attacking what they saw as Jewish influences on Christianity. So they harassed converts from Judaism to Christianity. They tried to bar non-Aryans from being ministers in the church. In some cases, they rejected the Old Testament. They denied the Jewishness of Jesus, and even tried to remove words like Hosanna and Hallelujah and other words that they deemed to be Jewish sounding. The German Christian movement was really at their peak right at the beginning in 1933, when approximately 1/3 of Protestant clergy joined. And we don't have reliable numbers for lay people and their support of the movement, but only clergy. And it's very important to remember that this movement came from within the church. It was not imposed on the church by outside Nazis, but it came from within. And many of its proponents were highly educated theologians and biblical scholars. So back to the Salvation Army, from the sources, it looks like most of the Heilsarmee officers supported Hitler, but also most of them were loyal to the International Salvation Army and all of the long tradition of internationalism that the Salvation Army had fostered up until that point. However, with the rise of the German Christian movement that I just described, a small number of officers saw an opportunity to break away from the international body, which they had wanted to do for some time. And those who took part in this separatist movement were enthusiastic National Socialists, and they admired the German Christians. And so they forged a plan to try to come under the patronage of the Nazis' new centralized Protestant Reich Church. Here you see a photo of the new Reich Bishop, Ludwig Müller, being installed into this. He's the first one, the first time that Germany had such a position. And there were some plans of trying to really create a Nazified, centralized Protestant church. And so this plan of, or hope to come under the patronage of this new church was really the only financially viable way for the Heilsarmee to ever consider cutting itself off from the London international headquarters. So over the summer and fall of 1933, The leader of this separatist movement, an officer named Adolf Palke, secretly corresponded with Reich Bishop Ludwig Müller and tried to convince him to accept the Hausarmee into the Reich Church. Now, it seems that Ludwig Müller was not terribly interested in this idea, but the correspondence remains and can be found in the Protestant Church Archive in Berlin. However, the plan did not go very well for Palke and his associates. Despite their efforts to keep these negotiations secret, the separatist movement became known to the Hausarmee national headquarters at the end of September. And the leadership quickly dealt with the situation by restructuring staff and reporting structures in an attempt to deflate this movement. Palke was removed from his post as leader of the Northern Division and was subsequently dismissed from the Salvation Army altogether. And apart from Palke, most of the other officers, it's maybe 7 or 8 people who were named, who signed their name to various documents that could be identified. Most of these other officers were not dismissed, but were reassigned to less influential posts in Germany. So back to the broader story of the emerging church struggle. When the German Christians tried to remove non-Arians from posts as clergy and officials, again, this is happening at the same time in the later part of 1933, there was a backlash from other Protestants. Now, these measures would have only affected a tiny number of people, but it wasn't exactly the anti-Semitism behind it that was the issue. What these other clergy were concerned about was that it challenged church independence. And over the next several months, a coalition emerged led by Pastor Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and others, and the Confessing Church was formed. Its founding statement, which some of you may be familiar with, the Barmen Declaration, largely written by theologian Karl Barth, strongly condemned Nazified theology as false doctrine and stated that when the church stopped using its authority legitimately, Christians had an obligation to resist. But I do want to point out that the Confessing Church limited its protests to maintaining the autonomy and the theological integrity of the Protestant Church. It wasn't protesting the legitimacy of the Nazi state itself or its treatment of Jews and other marginalized groups. In fact, it's been called a loyal opposition by historians. Certainly, this is an apt description of Martin Niemöller, who I spoke about at the beginning, who, even after he was imprisoned by the Nazis for his criticism of the regime, he volunteered to serve in the Navy when the Second World War broke out. Going beyond 1933-34, as anti-Nazi sentiment within the churches began to grow as the ideological demands of Nazism on the churches became more clear to people. And so there was some protest against the ideological extremism of the German Christian movement, and even some protest against government policies and practices. Hitler also became less interested in creating this Reich Church and withdrew, his official support of the German Christians, although they didn't exactly disappear altogether and remained, in many cases in influential posts as pastors or professors in theological departments. Now, the dynamics were a bit different for the Salvation Army due to its marginal status and foreign connections. And I can't, overstate this enough, that they really were seen as an English organization, even though by this time, most of the officers and soldiers and other employees of the German Salvation Army were Germans. And as I said, many of them even supported the Nazi regime, and they were certainly supportive of Germany itself and for the German war effort once it began. But despite all of that, they were still seen as foreign, and this brought them under suspicion by the Nazi authorities. But like many of the other smaller Christian groups in this time period, the Salvation Army really aggressively shaped its public profile. They really made an effort to convince the authorities and the wider public that it was loyal to Germany and that it did not pose any threat to the Nazis' vision for a Volksgemeinschaft, or an ethno-national community, a national community based on, race and other definitions of belonging. So after General Evangeline Booth intervened, in fact, she sent a telegram directly to Hitler. And I guess I do have time. I have this on a slide. I will just show you the telegram because it is quite interesting. She says, "Please allow me to express my deepest appreciation and sincere gratitude for your conciliatory attitude toward the Salvation Army in Germany. The only reason for our existence lies in the alleviation of grief and sorrow and in the healing of suffering. I wish that the members of the Salvation Army in Germany, both individually and as a whole, can participate in the efforts to create a better Germany." This is a very carefully worded, perhaps you can appreciate the difficulty in crafting this sort of message to Hitler. But it seems that General Booth wrote it in a way that was convincing to Hitler, and he subsequently allowed the Salvation Army to continue operating in Germany. So the Heilsarmee became an approved auxiliary organization of the National Socialist People's Welfare Organization. So this was the official government-sponsored welfare organization that was supposed to control and coordinate all charity and public welfare. And most organizations were simply, ended or subsumed under the NSV, but the Salvation Army and the welfare organization of the Seventh-day Adventists also were listed as an auxiliary organization. So they continued to operate under their own auspices with their own branding and whatnot. But they were, over the next few years, increasingly called upon to actually do a lot of work for the NSV that would have overlapped with the Salvation Army's own efforts. So to raise money, and I have a slide here, which shows some of this work in the 30s. I think these pictures are all from 33 to 35-ish. So they were called upon to raise money and participate in NSV activities like winter relief, which was a program to aid the poor over the winter months. So we see the top center photo shows in Berlin a meal for children, for poor children in a part of Berlin. On the right-hand side is, hopefully be familiar to a lot of people tuning in tonight. This is a Christmas collection in Frankfurt, and it says in German, please make a happy Christmas for the poorest in Frankfurt. And on the bottom is some tents set up for a youth camp, summer youth camp. And so the Salvation Army continued to do, a lot of the charity work and social welfare work they had always done. They tried to continue operating their own institutions, their overnight hostels and overnight shelters, maternity homes, etc., kindergartens. But they were increasingly, pulled in two directions, and it was very difficult to financially make this sustainable. But until war broke out in September of 1939, the organization continued to have contact with the international headquarters in London, like we saw at the beginning with that image of the newspaper cover from the visit from the English Salvation Army and the chalk farm banned in 1936. So alongside these now famous developments of the German church struggle and the efforts of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Pastor Martin Niemöller, Karl Barth, and many others, we can see this sort of smaller church struggle unfolding within the Salvation Army. And much of the internal debate about who fell onto which side or who tried to stay neutral in the middle, much of this is really lost to history, since many of the Hausarmee's documentation was bombed near the end of the war at their headquarters in Berlin. And so a lot of this history is quite difficult to piece together, but I think this part of the history is important for both Salvationists who have a duty to understand their history of their movement, and for those of us who are interested in the broader history of the Christian church's responses to Nazism and the Holocaust and their role in legitimizing and supporting the Nazi regime. And so to go back to the title that I chose for tonight, Polarized Communities in Uncertain Times. These were certainly uncertain times in 1933, 1934. You see this seismic shift happening in Germany, and from democracy to dictatorship to whole groups of people being excluded, having their rights taken away, and eventually their citizenship stripped. And yet at the time, of course, the people who were living through this, the historical actors, did not have the benefit of hindsight. They did not know what was coming. And so we can really, what I try to do in analyzing this history is to try to recognize the lived experience of people at the time and try to understand, their motivations and their choices that they made at different times without sort of projecting back on them everything that we know now as to what unfolded in the Nazi regime after. So I know that I probably spoke quickly and covered a lot of material, but I think I will end it there so that we have plenty of time for questions, and I'm happy to revisit some of these slides if you're interested in seeing the images again. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen right now and hand it back over to Michael.
Thank you. There we go. That was an amazing presentation, so interesting. So if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A function, and I'll try to engage Rebecca in some conversation about this. The first question that we have is kind of a big question. What might you suggest is the biggest theological or practical challenge to followers of Jesus in the long, lingering shadow of the Holocaust in the current theological, political, multi-faith context?
I mean, that's a great question. You're right, it's a big one, but it really does get to the heart of the matter of why we study this. So let me see. I would say I will answer with two big challenges. The first one is sort of what I laid out at the beginning, is that I think that it is difficult for Christians to acknowledge their own active role in society, especially when things are going terribly wrong, like it did in Nazi Germany. And there does seem to be this persistent desire to try to look at the churches as sort of hovering outside of politics and outside of society, like they were just on the sidelines and that things were happening to them, rather than trying to really analyze how the churches and the people that make up the churches are people like everyone else, with varying levels of influence, of course, depending on what group and what time period you're talking about. But certainly they were embedded in society. The second thing I think is the big theological challenge post-war is for the churches, and I would say this is for the Protestant and the Catholic churches, was to really recognize their role in Christian anti-Judaism and the theology of supersessionism, this idea that that Christianity had replaced Judaism after Jesus' atonement on the cross. And for a long time, the churches, they looked at what happened and they saw it more in terms of prejudice or racism, and said, that's horrible that happened, but they weren't really interrogating or looking at how perhaps their own theological tradition may have contributed in some way to the persecution of Jews. And again, I'm not saying that the Holocaust, that there's a straight line, as some people have said, there's not a straight line from Luther to Hitler, or there's no straight line from anywhere to anywhere. But still, I think the churches have done a lot of work in the second half of the 20th century to re-examine their own theological traditions.
Thank you. Another large question, one that certainly kind of was raised in my mind while listening to you. Learning from this episode in Salvation Army history, what signs should we be watching for as an organization when it comes to nationalism and other threats to Christian ministry?
Wow, that's a good one. Well, I think the Salvation Army is a little unique in amongst other similar Christian organizations and denominations, because it did have such a strong tradition of internationalism, because the Army, remained centralized. It had an international headquarters in London, and yet it expanded globally. It really saw itself and it operated as one organization. And this has never been easy throughout the Army's history. There have been, different countries at different times have felt the pull of their own nationalism of their context, or thought, oh, we're more whatever than we are British. But the Army did put such effort into this internationalist identity that I think it was a positive thing, but maybe sometimes sort of papered over the very real pull of people's national identity and nationalism in these specific contexts. And so, for what the Army could be doing now to be watching for nationalism, I would say to really interrogate the idea of internationalism and not take it for granted, perhaps, and unity, national or international unity among the Salvation Army.
Thank you. Were there any key turning points in the Salvation Army's leadership's relationship with the Nazis? Were they like the proverbial frog in a frying pan?
Well, I think the big dramatic moments were the ones that I described at the very beginning, and then they sort of settled into this pattern. And then we have the period from 1934, I say, until the war starts. And then again, everything changes in the fall of 1939 when the war changes. And then it was sort of all hands on deck for the war effort. And then as the war went on and Germany started being bombed, that again was a real game changer. And so many resources had to be put towards the war effort. So for instance, at some point, they were not allowed to print their newspaper, the War Cry, anymore because of they wanted to conserve paper. So this was like a national, regulation imposed on them. It wasn't anything specific to the Salvation Army. But there were all these little things like that later the Salvationists telling the story after the war kind of interpreted as signs of being persecuted against by the Nazis, but that I and other historians of the war years would interpret as, yes, the Germans suffered during World War II, but that's, not quite the same thing as the suffering that they subjected others to in other ways. Those were the sort of the big turning points.
What was the effect of the Army's evangelical work as time went on? The questioner says, my father used to tell me that in Amsterdam during the occupation, no open airs were allowed, no uniforms, no brass bands. Did that start in Germany before the war? Was it a gradual process?
Yeah, I know a little bit about the Salvation Army history in other European countries. And really, I find it fascinating because the dynamic was very different in these other countries that were occupied by Germany, because there they were sort of opposing the Nazis or helping the national resistance movement was a patriotic act. Whereas in Germany, the patriotic act was sort of supporting the Nazis. So you could see it was very different for them in Amsterdam. And so I think a lot of the Salvation Army officers in the Netherlands, Belgium, France, really got very involved in the resistance movements and doing both illegal and legal work of, distributing food and hiding Jewish children and having clandestine meetings. And yes, they were much more restricted in terms of like wearing uniforms or having these public meetings and things like that. In Germany, that just didn't happen. Right? They were allowed to wear their uniforms and whatnot.
While the German army was operating in conjunction with the NSV, were any members arrested and sent to concentration camps?
I have not come across any Salvation Army officers who were arrested and sent to concentration camps in Germany. Again, I think that Salvationists got into trouble with the authorities in these other countries, in occupied countries, but not in Germany. You could also ask a similar question. Maybe they weren't arrested, but did any of them ever help Jews or get in trouble for helping people that the Nazis didn't like? I found a handful of cases, not very many in Germany, unfortunately. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more out there, but this history was not well analyzed or well collected even in the post-war years. And so there might have been more Salvationist Germans, flying under the radar. There are a few who did sort of help Jews, but they were never found out, or they were never arrested or fined or anything. Now, the Gestapo did, I mentioned in the lecture that they viewed the Salvation Army with suspicion, just on account of being a religious organization that was foreign. And, the Nazis were trying to figure out who's who and what's what, and which ones, have communist leanings and which ones don't, and which ones might be a threat. And so there were Gestapo who would sort of go to meetings or to try to spy on Nazis. That's the extent of it.
The questioner says, so if I understand it, the Salvation Army was accepted as a social work agency within Nazi Germany. Was there any real recognition of it as part of the Christian church? Was it a conversionist evangelical mission ever brought to the fore by the Salvation Army itself in Nazi Germany? Do you think General Booth's telegram to Hitler seems perhaps too coy on this score?
That's a great question. I'm scrolling down. I don't to where that's. Oh, here it is. Okay, so the Salvation Army in Germany, like in many other countries, I think it really found its groove once William Booth did decide to pivot to include social work in the very end of the 19th century. But I wouldn't say that it moved from evangelism to social work, but rather it encompassed the social work as part of it. And so the German Salvation Army, like the Salvation Army in other countries, saw the two parts of that work as integrally intertwined. Yes, they did like religious work or evangelism work, and they had their social work institutions, but these two things, in both a theoretical sense and in a practical sense, were intertwined, and both were seen as important part of the Salvation Army. I shouldn't have to tell this audience, explain that to you. I'm sure you could all articulate that better than myself. But this is certainly true in Germany. In terms of how the government or how the German public saw it, did they understand that whole idea of those two parts being intertwined? Yes, it was seen as a Christian church. on the census, you could list, if you wanted to, you could list the Salvation Army as your religious affiliation. So it was seen as a church, or as a denomination. The term that they would have used is sect. It was lumped in with the sects in Germany, but it was more than just a social work organization. I think General Evangeline Booth's telegram to Hitler was, it was a very delicate thing to write, because she wanted to make the army appear innocuous, and she wanted to be truthful, and yet make Hitler just seem like there wasn't anything to worry about, and on that point, I think she did her job, and it kind of worked.
In your research, have you come across stories of families of Salvationists who were split because of opposing support of the Nazis?
In this time period?
Yeah.
Well, very interesting. I don't know, again, there are so many sources that you wish you could get to that are not there. And so a lot of it is reading between the lines. I don't know how much of a split there was, but there was a family, the father was the publisher of the newspaper, the Kriegsruf war crime newspaper, and they had several children. One of their sons, and so they're like a big Salvation Army family in this, quite close-knit German Salvation Army community. And several of their other children become officers, and as they grow up, they have roles in the Salvation Army. But they have one son who, and I don't know the story behind it, but all I know is that he went to medical school and became a doctor. He actually became an OBGYN. And then during the war, he had a position at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. I'm quite sure it was Ravensbrück, because that was a women's camp. I'm just trying to get the details straight in my mind. But he worked at this camp and was actually convicted or charged as part of the Nuremberg trials after the war, charged with war crimes. And he ended up committing suicide, as many of these defendants did, before he could be brought to trial. So he definitely took a hard turn there in terms of career choice. And I went and I actually looked at his records, because he joined the SS, the Nazi SS organization. So I went back and I looked at his records, because I was so curious, son of a Salvation Army family, my goodness. And it's so interesting. He lists for his religious affiliation, he lists that he was just Protestant, like evangelisch. He was part of the Protestant church. Does not mention anything, but I know for a fact that this is the same guy. Like this, he is the son of the Salvation Army family. So what kind of rift that caused in his family, I don't know. Maybe his parents approved of the whole thing. I just don't know. So I don't want to speculate, but yeah.
There are several questions here that I want to kind of bring together because they're asking about the post-war reaction, both the Salvationist realization of what happened and the healing within the Salvation Army community that needed to happen after the war. I was wondering if you could speak to what happens after the war.
Yeah, I need to do more research about what happens. I know that so in Germany, when Germany finally divided in 1949 into East Germany and West Germany, that it was actually in East Germany that the communist government did shut down the Salvation Army. They were not allowed to operate anymore. So, even though they had managed to get through the Nazi years, it was kind of suppressed in East Germany. I think that for a long time that the Salvation Army did not honestly take an honest look at their history, and which is typical of many Germans, Christian or many parts of German society were not too eager to take a hard look at that period of history, really until they were forced to over the decades. And now I would say Germany's post-war reckoning, or its reckoning of the years during the Nazi period, is quite robust. The Salvation Army, I'd say, is a bit behind in this, but it also makes it kind of exciting to do this kind of history when it is still unknown. I'm not sure what the actual questions were that people asked, but I would just add in to go along with that. I think what really might help, because to better understand this history, instead of just sort of demonizing, oh my goodness, they were so horrible, they supported the Nazis, is to look at the Salvation Army more internationally, and to look at how the army reacted in these other European countries that were affected by the war, because those stories too are very not well known. There's a Salvation Army officer from Amsterdam who was awarded the Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem for helping Jewish children during the war. There are many other accounts that, if you go into Holocaust survivor testimony, people who have told their stories about how they survived during the Holocaust, many of these Jews from Switzerland, from the Netherlands, from France, tell all of these stories about what the Salvation Army did to assist them. And to, they say things like, the Salvation Army didn't show any prejudice to me, or they treated us all the same, or, it's a very different dynamic of what was going on, I would say. And I think a more holistic view of this very difficult time period and this very difficult war would help us to better understand, Salvationist history.
A reminder. Thank you. I'm mindful of the time. It's almost 8 o'clock. I want to thank you, Rebecca, for joining us today. Another excellent presentation, really thought-provoking, really engaging. And aside of Salvation Army history, I certainly didn't learn in Corps Cadets. So thank you very much. And I want to thank all the people who attended. Thank you so much for giving of your time and spending it here with us. This is the final Earl Robinson lecture of the 2021-22 season. And we'll be back next year with more interesting talks on faith and the Christian faith in the world. So thank you very much.